So based on this text for this morning, Psalm 14, I want to talk about atheism. And the way I want us to think about it is about two types of atheism. And maybe this will help us think about what the psalmist is talking about. So I want us to think about two types of atheism. The most common type that we're most familiar with, I would call an intellectual or a theoretical atheism, right? Atheism means not believing in God. And what we tend to refer to as atheism is the position of a person who says, I don't think there's a God. In fact, I see no reason to believe that there actually is a God. And we might think about someone, and this is not to malign this person because actually you'll see later I'm not maligning this person, but someone like Richard Dawkins, who wrote the book, The God Delusion, and talking about why he can't find a good reason to believe in God. And this is what I would call intellectual atheism, a theoretical atheism. And if you look at the reasons that people often give, there's some credence to what they're saying. One kind of line of reasoning is the idea of deities and gods and divine beings goes back to an ancient time when we didn't know how things worked. And so we thought that some God was making this happen. But these people would reason. Today we have, through science and through investigation, have figured out why things work. And so we don't really believe kind of in the superstitious idea that gods lie behind, the thunder, that the thunder is somehow the rolling sound of a god. That'd be one of their reasons for saying they find it difficult to believe in God. Another would be that generally, and this isn't about just Christianity, but generally they would say that religion has often been the source of a lot of trouble in the world, a lot of wars, a lot of animosity, people mistreating one another in the name of all sorts of religions, pagan or modern, right? Now notice why they're saying that is because they find that wars are things that are distasteful, that are abominable to their sense of what is right. And because they don't like war and destruction and suffering, they say religion has often been a source of that. And maybe the biggest thing that you'll hear is, particularly about a Christian perception of God, is someone will say, I have trouble believing in a God because how could a good God who's all-powerful and all-knowing, who created this world, have it in such a mess, right? And again, they say that, people who take this intellectual atheistic position say that because they want there to be a better world than the world that is, right? They see the suffering, they see the tragedy, and they say, where is the good, all-powerful, all-knowing God that some allege is over all of this? When it's such a mess, I just can't believe that there's a God like that. That is what I would call intellectual or theoretical atheism. And for me, I have a lot of sympathies with that reasoning. Right? I don't say, oh, they're completely wrong. They have no basis to say that. No, they've got some good points. There are some difficult things to grasp about all of this. And so Richard Dawkins is a person who looks at things that way. The question is, what kind of person is Richard Dawkins? Well, I think it's very interesting that one of his objections to believing in God is found in a book entitled River Out of Eden. Notice how his title has something to do with conception of God. And he's writing in that book, and he says, as he's writing that paragraph at that moment, he says, thousands of animals have died suffering. And he's talking about, I don't think Richard Dawkins enjoys watching a National Geographic special and watching the cheetah take down the gazelle. If you've seen that, the cheetah gets a grip on the gazelle's throat. The gazelle thrashes, kicking, slowly dying, while the cheetah with the teeth on its throat basically asphyxiates it. And Richard Dawkins is the kind of person that bothers him. He's seeing an animal suffering. Not that he discounts human suffering. Because some people could say, well, humans suffer because the things we do to each other. But here he's just saying, it seems like the way this world is, there's just a tremendous amount of suffering. And he is a person who is disturbed by all of that. And so we can't imagine that there is a good God who made it so that there's so much pain. So what I like that I sense about Richard Dawkins is he is a man of great love. And he has a love for people, and he has a love for children, and he has a love for animals. And all the time that he sees, every time he sees a child suffering with childhood leukemia or something, it makes him think, how can there be a God? He's a man of great love. And he just can't square the realities of life with the fact that there could be a God over it all. Sometimes we might think, well, the enemies of Christianity are these intellectual atheists. But let me suggest to you, the enemies of Christianity are not those who say there is no God. The enemies of Christianity are those who say we don't have to love our neighbor. Because what's at the heart of Christianity? Not a statement about whether there is a divine being, but the heart of Christianity is a way of living, not just the ideas I hold in my head, but the way I live each day. And if someone says, well, you don't have to love your neighbor, that person is much more of a threat to what it means to be a Christian than the person who conceptually says, I can't wrap my mind about there being a God because I'm a person of great love. See, the person who says you don't have to love your neighbor is not a person of great love. That person is much more of a threat to what it is that we find Jesus teaching us. So I want us to look at this psalm, because it'd be easy to read this psalm in the opening part in verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, and think the psalmist is talking about people like Richard Dawkins who say there is no God. But let's look carefully at what is being said in the psalm, because I can remember my undergraduate professor, Dr. Clyde Woods, who was a professor of Old Testament, who had gotten his doctorate at Hebrew Union, which is basically a Jewish university. He went and studied with the rabbis. They actually wanted him to convert. It's like, you're so good at this, why don't you just be a Jew? And he's like, no, I want to be a Christian, but I came here to study with you guys because I wanted to understand the way you read it, the Old Testament. And I remember Dr. Clyde Woods saying, there were no atheists in the ancient world. That this statement, there is no God, is not an atheistic statement as we think of it. So let's see what kind of statement it is, because I'm suggesting this morning there are two kinds of atheism. There's a theoretical, intellectual atheism, and then there's what I'm calling an everyday atheism. That's an atheism of practicality. So notice what's happening in this psalm. After the psalmist says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God, he goes on to say, they are corrupt, they have committed abominable deeds. This is not an atheism of the mind, this is an atheism of action. This isn't someone who loves their neighbor, but has a problem of imagining that there could actually be a God and thinking about it rationally. This is, the psalmist says, someone who, when they say there is no God, they go and do things that are against God, right? This is an atheism of action and not theory. It's not of the intellect, but it's of behavior. And so the psalmist says, and I think it's not concerning all humanity, because at first it sounds like it's about just every last person. But a little bit later down in the psalm, it talks about the generation of the righteous. In other words, I think as the psalmist is talking about not being able to find anyone, it's among those who take this kind of perspective that the psalmist is talking about. That when he looks among those, he finds people who are just corrupt and who do abominable things, and they're not seeking after God. Of those who have adopted this approach, and we still haven't defined what it is, but what I'm calling everyday atheism. And it says of them, verse 4, do all the workers of wickedness not know, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord? So what the psalmist says is these people who say there is no God, they then eat up people like bread. Obviously, that's metaphorical. They're not cannibals, literally. But they mistreat, take advantage, exploit others. They don't love their neighbor, right? These are people who say there is no God, and then they abuse and mistreat and oppress others. The psalmist says, but God, verse 5, is with the righteous generation. I think the point is, but God is with these very people, the ones that these who say there is no God oppress and mistreat. God is with the oppressed. God is with those they mistreat. Then in verse 6, again, I think speaking to these individuals who take this perspective, this everyday atheism, he says, you would put to shame the counsel of the afflicted. In other words, you would somehow try and thwart the plans that these oppressed make. But he says, the Lord is their refuge. God is helping these that you victimize. That's the kind of situation the psalmist is discussing. And it's particularly more clear in another psalm, if you will look at Psalm 94 with me for just a minute. This is where this kind of atheism, because in the ancient world, nobody believed there are no gods. Nobody. That's a modern phenomenon since the Age of Enlightenment, that now people conceptually think there are no gods. The ancient world, nobody said there were no gods, intellectually, theoretically, but practically they did. And that's what the Psalms are about. So notice in Psalm 94, beginning in verse 3, and it's so very similar. How long shall the wicked, O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? They pour forth words, they speak arrogantly, all those who do wickedness vaunt themselves. They crush your people, O Lord, and afflict your heritage. They slay the widow and the stranger and murder the orphans. They have said, the Lord does not see, nor does the God of Jacob pay heed. There's what they mean by there is no God. I can hear Dr. Clyde Wood saying what they mean is there is no God who sees, who hears, who knows, or to whom I will ultimately have to give an account. In other words, they're not denying there are gods, they're just denying that it matters that there are gods, right? That's what the psalmist is complaining about. That's the statement, there is no God, means there's no God who sees what I do. I can act with impunity. I will never have to answer for how I've mistreated my neighbor, because there's no God who sees or hears. Notice down in verse 9, he says, this is Psalm 94, he who planted the ear, does he not hear? He who formed the eye, does he not see? I mean, the psalmist is saying, if God has given us ears and eyes to see and hear, do you imagine he is deaf and blind? The point is, of course he sees and he hears, but you act as if there is no God. That's what I would call everyday atheism. It's not an intellectual, theoretical type of atheism because someone has difficulty conceiving of the concept of a God. It's the practical atheism of saying, I go to church on Sunday and I name Jesus as Lord and Savior, and then Monday, I just go about what I do, and what I just confessed makes no difference. I act however I need to act. I do whatever I have to do, right? To get ahead. It's just business or work or whatever. That's the kind of everyday atheism that's a real threat to the life of the church and to each one of us. Because I can put it this way. Each morning when I get up, I have the opportunity to decide if there will be a God today. Now, not in a kind of a sense of reality, is there a God? No, I get to make the choice when I get up in the morning, is there going to be a God today? And that God is love. And I have the choice of whether I am going to love and, as it were, bring God into existence, or not love, and there is no God. Certainly not in an existential way to me or to those I interact with. If I have not love, there is, in this sense, no God. But if I love, guess what? God exists for me and for the person I love. God comes into being. See, I am not in the least bit worried about Mr. Richard Dawkins or his books or his videos. That's not the problem. He's not really a threat to the church. It's an intellectual debate, and I can have that intellectual debate, but that's not the real danger. I'm more afraid of me and my capacity to act as if there is no God. To be, as it were, an everyday atheist. And the reason I say every day, because every day is when I have to make that decision. Will God exist today in me and through me to others? Oh yes, God exists whether I love or not, but in a practical, experienced way, God does not exist through me to others when I don't love them. See, that's the problem. Do I bring God into existence? Will I make God? Will I create God who created me? It's a different way of thinking about it, but I think it's a more immediate and personal way for us to think about what does it mean to believe in God? It's not to make a statement about what you think is reality, but it's a way to live each and every day and how we conduct ourselves. I would be much more comfortable with the person who says there is no God and never goes to church, but loves their neighbor, than the person who's always in church and says there is a God and does not love their neighbor. Who's the atheist? Right? Who's the atheist? My prayer for us is that we bring God into this world. In some ways, God still needs to be incarnate, to take on flesh for our neighbors. As God took on flesh in Jesus, God needs to take on flesh to the people I interact with. And I'm the conduit of that. I'm the opportunity to be, as it were, literally what a Christian means. You know, the word Christian means a little Christ. A little Christ. That's what I'm called to be. Not that I imagine myself as being the fullness of Christ, but I am called as a Christian to be a little version of Christ, a little incarnate God with us person to others. And when I do that, when I'm God in the flesh to others, I'm a little Christ, and in a little way offering some of the richness of the life of Christ to someone else, I am enriched and others are enriched. And this is what it vitally means for us to not be atheists, right? To bring God into the world around us, to decide, will he exist? That's up to me. I get to make the choice. May God give us the grace through his Spirit to always choose that he might be in us the life of the world.